The challenge when it comes to looking at ESG is that there are some issues that are more comfortable for boards because they fit more neatly within what would be good operational practice or good housekeeping. So everything to do with health and safety, even anti-corruption, product quality, good employee relations, good community relations, it kind of goes without saying that a company needs to manage those things actively and the board needs to oversee that effectively. Where it gets much more difficult is in areas such as climate change or human rights or issues where the level of control that the company has over the issue is heavily diluted. How boards receive and manage ESG information is probably one of the greater challenges facing boards because typically they get their information predominantly from management. I think a good board sees to it that its members receive information from outside presenters, brings in independent consultants and indeed stakeholders to exchange with the board so that we do have an opportunity to get different perspectives from those that are given to us from management. Bearing in mind, of course, that management knows the business better than anybody, but outside perspectives are equally important to forming a complete and balanced picture of the situation. The extent to which a board can effectively engage with management, challenge management on any issue, depends on the board's mastery of the subject matter, as well as plain old common sense, right? You need a combination of both. And of course, that is why board diversity is so important, because different people bring different specialisms. You're never going to have any one person who's expert on everything. Now, what is unfortunately very typically the case is that board directors do not possess expertise on ESG matters, even less so on the more complex and challenging issues like climate change, and climate change as they relate to a company's specific business model. And so, in order for board directors to do their job as effectively on ESG matters as they do on audit strategy, CapEx prioritization, change management, human capital, etc., the usual bread and butter of what boards do, remuneration, of course, which I forgot, they need to develop that skill set as well. When they acquire that level of confidence in the areas of ESG, and I would say climate is one of the most challenging ones, then they are better equipped to play just as effective a role of engagement and challenge. The board's role in overseeing corporate culture is something that is hotly debated right now. I happen to know this because I used to be an investor, and I know that the investors are looking at this issue very closely, and indeed have been ever since the financial crisis, because they regard the failures of the financial crisis as fundamentally being related to weak culture. Now, for me, having crossed over from being an investor where it was easy for me to lob those kinds of criticisms to being inside the boardroom, I appreciate just how challenging it is to play any kind of meaningful role in overseeing and influencing that culture. Because when you're sitting, in the boardroom, you don't necessarily see what's really going on in the company, and I think we have to acknowledge that fact. So we engage with management. If we're lucky, we have multiple opportunities to go on site visits and engage informally with staff. But ultimately, I think that on an issue like sustainability or governance or climate in particular, what is an incontrovertible fact is that companies, especially if they're large and complex, have a variety of views. They don't think like a monolith. And so there are people who think one way, people who think a different way, people who are expert in one thing and people who are expert in another. And they don't necessarily see eye to eye. And it's very often the case that there are entire departments within companies that are highly expert on sustainability, highly expert on climate change, but their views have no clout in the organization. Their views are not reflected in the CFO's office, in the Chief Strategy Officer's office, or in the CEO's office, and they're not reflected in the boardroom. The way to overcome that, and this comes back to the point on culture, is that if the board takes responsibility, direct responsibility for sustainability, for climate change, for maintaining a strong ethical culture, then by definition, these matters get brought to the board, and to the extent that they may be acted on in different divisions within the company who don't necessarily coordinate with each other as well as they should, the very fact that they all flow into the boardroom means that there is a much better ability to bring those activities together. And I can see that from my own, one of the companies on whose board I serve, which recently set up an interdepartmental team reporting straight to the CFO and on to the CEO on our climate transition strategy. And when you bring together in a team that meets regularly, head of finance, head of IT, head of strategy, head of HR, head of course, sustainability, head of technology and R&D, inevitably you are going to bring all these strands together into one integrated whole. And that is the only way that you're actually going to affect change. So it may not be that the board directors themselves have, unique expertise to make it happen, but the fact that they sit there and are answerable for an integrated answer to these questions means that it happens in an integrated way. So one of the bigger challenges facing boards is that, agenda item 3 will be a presentation on the sustainability strategy or a particular aspect of ESG, our modern slavery policy or our biodiversity policy or our water policy, or you name it. Agenda item 5 will be to approve a gigantic CapEx proposal where it is anything but clear that what was just approved in item 3 is being reflected in the way that item 5 is being designed and then implemented. And so the challenge there is for boards to see to it that there is genuinely integrated decision-making. Now, bearing in mind that boards meet as a whole board, it could be anywhere from 4 to, in my case, 16 times a year, and then there are the committees. The boards themselves tend to have overloaded agendas where there's only so much time one can spend on any one issue, and therefore we tend to focus on the big ticket items. But the committees are where we have the opportunity to unpack these different decision-making processes and make sure that they are upgraded to reflect new and emerging challenges. So again, climate change being one of the more complex challenges, how we integrate climate risk into the integrated risk management framework, which sits within the Risk and Audit Committee, how we integrate it into the audit process, how we integrate it into remuneration policy and incentive structures, obviously done by the Remuneration Committee, how it is incorporated into recruitment and training and succession planning, obviously the purview of the Nominations Committee. These are all areas where the committees have the opportunity to go into depth and to revisit the way things have always been done and see to it that there is a genuinely integrated process for making decisions that then percolate up to the board for approval. The risk of putting the cart before the horse and saying, let's develop climate KPIs, is that you're going to develop them on the basis of backward-looking indicators. You're going to develop them on the basis of, a company's ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. When in fact, if we're talking seriously about long-term transition, you want those KPIs to be set to specific milestones on the road to decarbonization. And that means taking some time to chart that journey with reasonable clarity and with interim points so we can say, if the company has shifted its product mix in this way, then we can tie that into the long-term share reward plan. Until we put those two pieces together, it's a little bit mismatched. Now, obviously, there are any number of other areas where it's easier to tie pay to outcomes, and it remains an inescapable fact that people do what they're paid to do. Occasionally, they will do more than they're paid to do, but if you pay them to do the opposite of what you want them to do, it's difficult for them to do it. So if you reward them to, maximize on certain indicators, which are inevitably tied to certain negative outcomes in respect of the environment or health or safety or human rights, then don't be surprised if this is what managers do. We need to think about these unintended consequences that come from setting objectives in a way that hasn't been thought through holistically. But it's also important to look at not just what's going to happen in 1 year and 3 years, but what's going to happen in 5, 10, 15, and 20. Here again is an opportunity for boards to play a virtuous role, because we are there to represent the interests of the company as a whole, by which we mean shareholders as well as the broader array of stakeholders, including future generations. And if that means taking a longer-term view, we cannot do this at the expense of our current shareholders. And so we need to work together to influence the policy environment in which we operate, and we need to support our management when they take these courageous steps and try to make those necessary changes.